I'm Joel Upton. I'm extremely grateful to the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society and the Association for Contemplation, Contemplative Mind and Higher Education. These two organizations have done more for me during the past 10, 12 years than I can possibly describe here. I would always thank Mirabai Bush and Arthur Zients, of course, along with Tsunanda, Marcus, and Beth and Carrie for all of their assistance. So I'm very happy to be here. I hope you can hear. I hope this is all working. I appreciate the opportunity to be, for a brief moment, on the edge of a precipice, having never done anything like this before. My attempt in the next few minutes will be to step outside our habitual box in order to challenge its exclusivity and domination of our thinking and our lives, if not our very being. My purpose is not to offer an exotic alternative box, but to challenge the exclusivity and the domination of all boxes of any kind over our thinking, our lives, and our being. To begin, may I please recall, and by recalling honor, the first annual conference of the Association for Contemplative Mind and Higher Education called, as you'll remember, the Contemplative Heart of Higher Education. Let Henry David Thoreau focus for us the word higher. The morning, which is the most memorable season of the day, is the awakening hour. Then there is least somnolence in us, and for an hour at least, some part of us awakes, which slumbers all the rest of the day and night. Little is to be expected of that day, if it can be called a day, to which we are not awakened by our genius, by the nudgings of some servitor, are not awakened by our own newly acquired force and aspirations from within, accompanied by the undulations of celestial music instead of factory bells, and of fragrance filling the air, to a higher life than we fell asleep from, and thus the darkness bear its fruit, and prove itself to be good no less than the light. To awaken every day to a higher life than we fell asleep from last night is by itself a transforming process without end. With this continual awakening in mind, my premise this afternoon is simply this. Contemplation is the palpable intimation of wholeness beyond limitation. Any effort to visualize an otherwise interior and private reality is an act of sharing that affirms our collective aspiration as human beings to awaken to a higher life than we fell asleep from. Visualizing contemplation by any means is in effect a bridge from the kingdom of physical gravity and separation to the kingdom of integration and invisible grace. The first step out of our habitual box is to avoid simply showing instances of objectively perceived contemplation, including exemplary places of contemplation, such as, for one example, even Walden Pond, or Worthington, Massachusetts, or a Zen Buddhist temple in Kyoto, Japan. To step out of this box is also to avoid simply objectively presenting exemplary moments of embodied contemplation, even at Ryoanji, on a beautiful fall day. Those men sat there for 15, 20, 30 minutes without moving, as did this young man, or this woman who was there for the better part of 45 minutes. Or I might have just simply pointed to an extraordinary etching by Rembrandt van Rijn, Christ Healing the Sick, in the British Museum, to find one of the most beautiful images of a person caught in meditation that you will ever see. Or I might have shown Roger van der Weyden's Annunciation in the Louvre, where both the angel and Mary are the very embodiment of a contemplative knowing. Although the pleasure of such images is great, my purpose draws on what I took away from Parker Palmer's provocative keynote commentary at the conference entitled Uncovering the Heart of Higher Education in San Francisco a couple of years ago. I understood the challenge of that moment was to address directly the nearly exclusive and dominant position of ratiocinated knowing in education and in our lives generally. So my purpose in the next few minutes will be to exteriorize contemplative knowing, not as an alternative to ratiocinated knowing and wisdom, nor as a mere complement to it. My purpose is to visualize contemplation as well as contemplative knowing and being as a fully capable and, truth be told, essential act of convergence between and among all contradictory realities that comprise conscious human being. My goal is to visualize contemplative knowing as the very embodiment of mutuality that offers us individually and collectively precisely those intimations of wholeness that allow moral meaning and purpose to flow into our lives. In one too often neglected word, my target is the art of art, not to say compassion. With great and enduring admiration for Jon Kabat-Zinn, I would like to imagine contemplative knowing not as, quote, stress reduction, unquote, but rather as turmoil redemption, or perhaps the sublimation of the natural struggle between eros and insight that might result in Rainer Maria Rilke's more human love. And this more human love that will fulfill itself infinitely considerate and gentle and kind and clear in binding and releasing will resemble that which we are preparing with struggle and toil, the love that consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and salute each other. So what might such contemplative knowing or a more human love look like at its very core? The world that Parker Palmer challenged us to engage directly is a world of walls. Whether those walls are the massive ones that surround Rome, the city of Rome, the ancient city, and the modern city, like these, or whether those walls are the walls that surrounded the Roman Empire, here visible as Hadrian's Wall as far away as Northumbria, England, or whether those walls are the ephemeral, ironic wall of the contemporary process artist Christo, known as Running Fence, in Marin County, California. In each of these cases, the cognitive reality remains the same. This common cognitive reality, with profoundest ontological implications, may be characterized at its core according to the classical era law of the excluded middle. That is, something is what it is until it is not and becomes something else. This or that defines the ratiocinated world of ever more refined divisions and which structure its own self-limiting moral order. The law of the excluded middle, in whatever guise it may appear, remains more or less this: a walled world of rational distinctions and separation, which, when it becomes exclusive, leads to isolation, alienation, then tyranny, and then despair, or less dramatically perhaps, the unrelieved stress of confrontation and unfulfilled craving, or more coldly, simply P, non-P logic. The second P was supposed to be over on the right-hand side. One example, and this is only one example of a contemplatively converging world of mutuality that I would try to visualize, takes shape in Japan. I show you first something simply called Looking West, Kyoto, Japan. I hasten to add, contemplative mutuality is not Japanese, of course. It is human. On first glance, I would call this example of what I'm trying to suggest Kyoto mist. In more explicit verbal terms, this image is an example of ainoma. Here are the Chinese, Japanese kanji characters for this extraordinary phrase that I'm going to try to suggest to you. In more familiar language, ainoma. The superficial, literal meaning of this phrase is merging space, made visible in the symmetrical pairing of the two kanji characters. Although there are countless examples of the converging of contradictory possibilities embodied by this phrase in Japanese art and culture generally, one realization of ainoma that is particularly vivid is a Hachiman-style shrine or place of Shinto devotion. Here I give you one example of a Hachiman-style shrine, the Tsurugaoka Hachiman Shrine in Kamakura, Japan, shown in a woodblock print. Although there are many parts of this image that would reveal ainoma, the entry area into the compound there, this extraordinary gate, and others, the area I'm going to focus on is this one with the third arrow in between two buildings. In the Hachiman Shrine at Usa in Oita Prefecture, Japan, the area I am pointing to is that area bracketed by these red arrows. Here is a Hachiman-style sanctuary and worship hall in plan, in a schematic drawing that I put together for you. There are two distinct areas in the structure. One, the worship hall, and the other, the sanctuary. The worship hall is the place for the worshiper, and the sanctuary is where the deity, or the Shinto kami, would descend to become present to the worshiper. Though separate and distinct, the worship hall on the right, the so-called haiden, and the sanctuary on the left, the honden, are manifestly but elusively, and I would like to use the word syzygetically joined or yoked by the space in between. This space is the ainoma I would have us try to enter. In fact, the technical architectural term for this space between two such structures is ainoma. The converging character of this space, of this shrine, is augmented by the presence of rain gutters at the foundations of the two buildings and by the surrounding platforms of each structure known as an engawa. At that point to the rain gutter, there are four of them. This area here that surrounds the entire building is an engawa, as is this one. Let me shift from plan to elevation of the same structure. Here are the two buildings in elevation. Here are the rain gutters and the ground upon which they sit. And here are two figures. On the right, the worshiper; on the left, kneeling, the deity. Two realities opposed and confronting each other. As I said, this shrine that I'm showing you here in elevation is seen as it rises up from the earth, or as we might drop into its space, using a favorite phrase of John Kabat-Zinn. Here is the ainoma of this elevation. And there again the kanji. In some instances, these two separate structures, the worship hall and the main hall or sanctuary, are covered by a single roof. Try to visualize and experience the simultaneously separate and converging realities of this complicated but finally sublimely simple spatial construction of mutuality. Rain, when it falls, coming from the roof, literally animates this elusive space. The surrounding air and fragrance, we might even imagine mist, or in Northampton today, snow, are additional living agents of this spatial mutuality, abstractly represented here, but I assure you palpably present to anyone occupying this space. In actuality, all of the senses respond to a remarkably heightened precognitive, pre-verbal, pre-rational intimation of wholeness that includes the area and space around the shrine, extending its reality toward infinity, replacing P non-P with a wonderful PNP. Not only are two discrete structures yoked together like planets, they are joined from inside to outside continuously. Although this remarkable construction of space is as familiar to Japanese people as walls are to us, the phrase ainoma, connecting or merging space, is curiously unknown to many contemporary Japanese. In the 11th century, however, the phrase ainoma was common and was used in Heian court love poetry to mean a place of mysterious meeting, as in the fateful encounter of lovers. It doesn't get better than that. Before moving to a particular site that will animate ainoma for us, remember that the Engawa, or side river as it is translated, is a critical structural component in this deliberate construction of merging space. The four white arrows remind us of where the Engawa is. One actual example of a living ainoma we might imagine entering is the Zen temple of Daisen-in in Kyoto. Just for the spelling, it is the Daisen-in, Kyoto, Japan. And Daisen-in is a sub-temple gently integrated into the large collective temple complex called Daitoku-ji in Kyoto. Here is an aerial view of part of Kyoto with the area of the temple I am describing, Daitoku-ji, roughly outlined in yellow. Here is the east gate, which we will go through, that leads into the inner part of the temple. Here's the sub-temple of Daisen-in that I'm going to show you. Again, the sub-temple at Daisen-in. Spatially, the very connectedness, the wall-less convergence of subordinate parts in this temple complex is itself a perfect example of institutional ainoma. The two large buildings with the circles on them in the left foreground are the Buddha Hall, the Butsuden, and the Dharma Hall of the collective Daitoku-ji. To approach Daisen-in, enter through this gate. The wonderful kanji directly in front of you has no other meaning than no cars allowed. But we will walk through that gate, up to that gate, and enter this extraordinary contemplative world. Having entered through the east gate of Daitoku-ji here, we pass by two symbolic gates, the so-called Mountain Gate and Messenger Gate, not visible in this photograph, and then proceed to this stone walkway, where if we had time we could pause for, as Goethe would say, tarry a moment, thou art so fair, and not move another foot. Notice that the gravel on the left, as well as on the right, clearer on the left, has been carefully raked. It is like that every day, all day. That arrow points to a private entry to Daisen-in on the left. And that arrow points to the public entrance to the sub-temple of Daisen-in, which we are going to enter. There is the public gate. We're standing in the public gate to the public entrance of Daisen-in in Kyoto. From here, follow the zigzagging stone pathway to the doorless threshold of Daisen-in, called a Genkan, identified with the red arrow, which, like the Engawa, is another place of experiential ainoma. This Genkan entry to Daisen-in leads to a corridor that will take us to the left, where we will arrive at the primary devotional building of the sub-temple, the Hondo, and the dry rock garden, which is the focal center of meditative contemplation at Daisen-in. Although there is an obvious structural wall directly in front of us, the garden lies just behind that arrow. Its purpose is to connect, not to separate or enclose. If we had more time, we could decipher this wall-less wall, but for now, move in through the Genkan, go to your left, and arrive at the dry rock garden of Daisen-in. Literally, there is nothing here but two mounds of countless tiny pieces of ordinary stone raised up from a bed of stone. But poetically or metaphorically, contemplatively, these ordinary mounds of stone become slowly but palpably extraordinary. Perhaps they are two worlds, two universes, two people, two solitudes, and every other contradictory reality you might imagine, joined in the flowing ripples of the precisely raked gravel, the very inverse of the law of the excluded middle. Slow, attentive, open meditation here evokes a deep reality of no center and no periphery, or simultaneous centripetal and centrifugal movement joined inexorably with stillness. The open fences, shrubs, and trees that line this asymmetrical space focus the dry rock garden even as they allow it to merge with the surrounding grounds of the other sub-temples that comprise the collective Daitoku-ji. An elusive but felt ainoma suspends the wholeness of this place, which is palpably greater by a factor of infinity than the sum of its parts. Again, the air of the moment, the fragrance, the undulation of the raked gravel, or an imagined mist, all contribute to this mysterious perception of wholeness beyond all fragmentation. Daisen-in, apparently so simple and so obvious, is in actual experience a most refined and fragile artistic and spiritual, not to say contemplative occasion of utter simplicity. Many hundreds of years old, Daisen-in is currently animated by its abbot, who is named Son Ozeki, who affirms the temporal as well as spatial ainoma of this place, in part by his daily ritual of re-raking this garden so that it will always be fresh and yet unchanged. May I say he celebrates a daily awakening to a higher reality in this garden. This is Son Ozeki in formal Zen Buddhist dress, standing in the private Genkan to Daisen-in, next to the dry rock garden. The word Genkan itself embodies ainoma. It means, quote, a place of preparation for a mystery, or a threshold of deep awareness. In every instance, ainoma is simultaneously structural and experiential. These are not merely objectively symbolic spaces. Among all of the mysteries that reveal themselves at Daisen-in, none is more powerful or immediate than this one. To be mindful of one's presence for even a brief moment here is to discover a merging of light and dark in which shadow measures illumination, resulting in a quiet homecoming that will soften even the hardest of enlightenment hearts. Let the precious dark wood of this platform, polished by the thousands of shuffling shoeless feet over the years, and the hard, bright white plaster become one together in the half-light that informs this amazing space. Although this platform is often called in English a veranda, sometimes a porch or deck. Here at Daisen-in, none of these English words comes close. Here, this particular construction is understood to be an engawa, or side river, caught up in the flow of another rock garden that descends into this space from the eastern side of the temple directly behind where we are standing, where if you were to go there, you will find another white river of stone. In my own experience, this engawa is the very essence of ainoma, serving its contemplative function as one more connector between the rationally isolated categories of inside and outside. Just ask yourself where one ends and the other begins. Being present in this space, one knows immediately and without any need of explanation that this engawa is neither outside nor inside, but both and neither. It is the very middle that reason would exclude, opening wide a primal threshold back to our being, to deepest awareness. Let these red arrows suggest the veil of water that would truly animate this space when it rains, dropping, if you permit me to say it, like mercy into our lives. Unfortunately, the open rain gutter at Daisen-in has been replaced by a modern overhead gutter for the convenience of less hardy modern tourists. One day during my own meditative practice at this temple, something truly wonderful happened that might help to visualize, if not literally animate, contemplation. A group of people, very seriously afflicted by mercury poisoning, gathered at the far end of this engawa for a moment of the most congenial Zen instruction imaginable, offered daily by the Abbot Sonozeki to anyone who comes into this space, as though he were performing an affable ainoma. Most of the people you will see could barely walk. They had to crawl to this place. Here is the Abbot Sonozeki, wearing his working clothes, the ones he wears when he rakes his garden, as I said, every morning. Let this yellow arrow point to this man. Watch him. Sonozeki continues to talk. There is the man. Keep your eye on the woman in the very center, just next to the woman smiling also. Her expression never changes. As Sonozeki continued to speak, the man I pointed to with the yellow arrow began twitching terribly, uncontrollably, painfully. There are his feet that suddenly burst out there. As I watched this, something wonderful happened. Everybody was tense and nervous except for that one woman, the man twitching in uncontrollable discomfort, and then that happened. The abbot of Daisen-in entered the space between him and his students. He knelt on the step of the engawa and tickled the feet of this distressed man, releasing him, his friends, and me with my camera, who had become implicated from the turmoil of the moment. Stress diminished, perhaps. But then this happened. He joined them. What words are the equivalent of this action? What reason could disassemble what has happened here? What else could this be other than stress redeemed? On another occasion, elsewhere in Kyoto, two friends of mine knelt for me in the engawa of their home that joins an interior space that contains a tokonoma or treasure alcove to their garden with a stone lantern. My purpose was simply to make an image, a photograph, that would show Goshima-san and his wife occupying the converging space, the structural ainoma of an ordinary Japanese home. The sliding panels to the left and right, by the way, are called shoji, and they are made of the thinnest possible paper. Goshima-san and his wife, wearing formal Japanese clothing, knelt quietly for me, facing each other, physically animating the middle space between me and the garden. Perfect. I snapped the picture. Picture was taken. And then, unplanned, Goshima-san and his wife looked at each other, and they did this. As these two solitudes bowed deeply to each other, they entered the excluded middle, reaffirming, enacting that more human love that joins them and flows between them and their Engawa, and that joins all that is here, where I am sitting, and there in the garden. This was the place of mysterious meeting, as in the fateful encounter of lovers. This, if ever there were one, is a place of love. My words cannot capture what happened at this moment, but perhaps the immaculate words of Simone Weil will help. All of the natural movements, this is real-time performance, all of the natural movements of the soul are controlled by laws analogous to those of physical gravity. Grace is the only exception. Grace fills empty spaces, but it can only enter where there is a void to receive it, and it is grace itself which makes this void. To return to Parker Palmer's vivid challenge to us, here, in the name of security, is the ultimate regression of exclusive ratiocinated knowing, learning, and perhaps being, as contrasted with our immanent potential for the integrated mutuality manifest in the early spring flowering of a cherry tree that illuminates even as it is illuminated by a late afternoon light that prefigures the dawn that will follow the coming night. And here is that dawn, with the sacred Mount Hiei on the northeast corner of Kyoto in the background. The sun rising through the purple mist on the right, and the International Conference Center, Kokusai Kaikan, on the left, where only a few years ago the United States refused to sign the Kyoto Environmental Accords. If I could invoke Oliver Wendell Holmes's well-known admonition, always to seek simplicity on the far side of complexity, then I could bow to a most famous contemplative aphorism: be the change you want to see in the world. By reversing Mahatma Gandhi's wisdom with visualize the change you want to be. To return to our world and Henry David Thoreau where we began, let these candles be the interior reality that knows the hard truth that the wax gives itself up to the fire. In silhouette, this luminous image echoes almost exactly a view of the Cathedral of Our Lady of Chartres in France at sunset that reverses the light-dark relation. The question with which I would end is, will we awaken to a higher reality than we fell asleep from? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was wonderful. Thank you for taking us to Daisen-in and your thoughts on the merging space. We're going to open it up now for questions from participants. You're welcome to type in a question for Joel to address, or if you click on the little hand icon and raise your hand, and you're wearing a headset with audio, we can try to bring you in that way. Okay. So we're just taking a look at the question log here. And I'm going to give the headset back to Joel, and he can address some of these that are coming forward. Here we go.
I'm reading now, how can these ideas be applied in the classroom? There are endless answers. I would begin with an answer that I don't mean to be glib. I read once that Martin Buber used to give extraordinary lectures that everybody found boring beyond words. But the minute the lecture was over and he joined the group, as Sonozeki joined that group, and began talking to people directly about things that they cared for, the deeper lessons of his otherwise boring lecture became animated and apparently were absolutely spellbinding. So sometimes we walk away from the lectern and join not just physically the people, but engage the thoughts that are really compelling to them. In talking about ainoma, it reminds me to do that. It reminds me also to always remind the students and myself that the ratiocinated and analytical way of knowing the world that we so cherish isn't the only one, and that you can often allow the students to be less than sharp every once in a while, and remarkable things will happen. I went to the Grand Shrine at Ise several times, oh, I'm sorry. The question is, I write from the Vermont Studio Center where I am a resident in sculpture. I have been working with the idea of space between and appreciate your thoughts. I wonder if you have applied the concept of ainoma at the Grand Shrine at Ise, Mie Prefecture. Well, thank you for your comment. I should say I've been to Ise several times, and the great problem with this seminar that I'm involved in here is that I could only show one temple. I think I have 5,000 that I would love to show. And one of the most remarkable Shinto shrines anywhere is, of course, the one at Ise. And at Ise, the way the space is organized is everything I showed you times a factor of something like infinity. The very fact that, as you well know, the primary deity sanctuary is alternated every 20 years. Every 20 years, the one that had existed, which is beginning to rot and fall to pieces, is removed, and an identical new one replaces it. Not in the same place, but just to the left. So there's a kind of temporal and physical ainoma in the very living construction of this thing, many, many, many hundreds of years old. But every time you go there, there will be a brand new sanctuary standing next to the one that is rotting before your eyes. It is an astounding, astounding experience. There is a famous Buddhist priest, Saigyo, I believe his name is, who wrote a short poem on his arrival at Ise. He said, I came to this temple, this shrine. I knew nothing of what it was, but I was reduced immediately to tears. Nice question. Joel, thank you for this wonderful lecture. Thank you. And for your extraordinary images. I will be teaching a large world art seminar next semester and am already planning to teach Zen temples such as Ryoanji and Daitoku-ji. Would you recommend some of your favorite reading on ainoma or one of your own publications? Deborah Haynes, University of Colorado. Well, Deborah, thank you. I can see you before me. There is a book, I didn't bring a bibliography with me. There is very little written on ainoma as such. I have to tell you something. Ainoma is a term I discovered in desperation, because when I first went to Japan, I went to teach a course on Japanese Buddhist temples, and I thought that for the first time in my adult life I wanted to confront something without having read about it first. And so, truth be told, I went from Amherst College to Doshisha to teach students, reading nothing. And I simply went to the temples and engaged them directly without words with the students, and we learned from them. When I began to sense this converging space, this different kind of space, I went to a technical architectural book to discover that the space between two Hachiman Shrine buildings was called ainoma. So I will write to you, because I have a whole bibliography on ainoma. I have not yet myself published on ainoma, but will, I hope, soon. There are some readings, but in all honesty, a teacher would, and I don't mean this glibly, would do better to ask the students to sit still long enough to hear the beating of their own heart, and they will know more about ainoma than they will ever read. So that would be my first suggestion to you. Let them breathe. And by the way, the asymmetry of breathing in and breathing out is as perfect a physiological example in the West of ainoma as I can name. Nice question, Deborah. It's a question about ratiocinated, just R-A-T-I-O-C-I-N-O-T-A-T-E-D. It's in the dictionary. Oh no, oh no. It was a beautiful question. There was a beautiful question there about sound, and is there a sound relationship to ainoma? And that's a beautiful, beautiful question, because ainoma extends into every single aspect of our sensory awareness of the world. And there is in Japan a word called a zansho, which I won't spell right now, but it's a word that means lingering light. If you are sitting somewhere and the sun sets behind you and shines brightly on a distant hill, even though you're in the shadow, you are existing within lingering light. For a very old person, this is a very precious thing. But there is also something called lingering sound. In most Buddhist temples where there are large bells, when the bell rings, there is almost no sound other than a single boom that disappears almost immediately. But if you stand within the proximity of the bell, you can feel the reverberation even though the sound has passed. That is also called zansho, or lingering sound. So you have picked up, there is an anticipation of sound, the actual sound itself, its disappearance, and then memory and anticipation again, all very much part of Buddhist meditative practice. When those people came into Daisen-in, I heard them long before they came. And my own thought was, why do they let these noisy American tourists in here to ruin my meditation? I thought it was a group of college kids having fun. In fact, it was those terribly, terribly suffering human beings. But they had announced themselves long before they came, and long after they left, there was a silence that reverberated in me. So your notion of sound is absolutely vital. What? All right. How do you see black and white, or the idea of light and darkness? One of the things that I discovered at every single engawa that I visited, the temples and that side river or that porch, veranda, was that our cameras simply cannot possibly capture the range from the lightest light to the darkest dark in those places. You can focus on the dark and you lose the light. You focus on the light, you lose the dark. The camera is a dull instrument and can't possibly capture the overwhelming sensation of moving from the lightest light to the darkest dark. And it's that huge middle ground that our own instruments of ratiocinated understanding simply cannot access. Along with the sound, the fragrance in the air, the mist, the snow, and every other sensory reaction, light and dark are redefined in these places. It may be similar, if you like Goethe, that it is in the intersection between light and dark that color occurs. So I always see in the middle space in Japanese places something equivalent to Western ideas of color, at least through Goethe. Yeah, in that one. In Buddhist temples, another interesting question, I think it's Catherine Simon. In the Buddhist temples, the light or the shadow is so important. How is darkness worked with? Well, I can tell you the first thing there, and here I do have the bibliography on just the top of my head. The single thing you must read over and over and over is Junichiro Tanazaki's book called In Praise of Shadows. the exact counterpart to enlightenment thinking. And he talks about the shadow and the darkness within which one finds wisdom. So one of the remarkable things in most of these sites I have visited in Japan is that you enter into, as in that Genkan with the red arrow I showed you, you enter into the most amazing darkness. And then once you are in it and your eyes adjust, you begin to discover another kind of illumination, which I like to think of as the illumination of a higher reality. And I don't mean a transcendent Godhead. I simply mean that as you are in these extremely dark spaces by American Western standards, you discover another capacity for illumination. I've taken students into some small temple rooms where they feel at first a little bit claustrophobic because they are so dark. But within 5 or 10 minutes, the paper walls begin to glow and illuminate them in ways that they never imagined. So dealing with the dark is indeed a serious reality, architecturally and I think contemplatively. I like the chapter on ainoma in what is Japanese architecture. Yes, that's a very nice book. After I discovered all of this, and I read that with great satisfaction, that I wasn't all alone. So there are people who do talk about this. The Japanese, I would like to emphasize this though, I have spoken about architectural ainoma in Japan several times, and I am always amazed when I ask an audience of university people, for how many of you is the phrase I used, ainoma, and I speak no Japanese, familiar? And no hands go up whatsoever. And I say, well, was the concept that I was describing familiar? And they say immediately, oh, of course it's familiar. It's the only way on earth to construct space, with no idea whatsoever about our precious walls. Nice question. That's a nice question too. Thanks so much for your presentation. Thank you. You've talked about middle space. How should we think about the non-merged spaces? I know you didn't mean to belittle such spaces, but can you say more about their presence? I began by trying to say that I want to avoid all boxes. And if there is a purpose in making ever finer distinctions that would exclude a middle in order to find a this and that relationship, if that serves the purpose of your thinking, do that. My only thought is when it becomes a restraint, when it closes off other possibilities, be free to jump out of that box. Not to exclude it, but to recognize that it has its own limitations. I'm not suggesting by any means that the world of ainoma is not fraught with as many problems as the world of walls. It is. But I think simply to be aware of the possibility of ever finer reasoned distinctions, as opposed to allowing reasoned distinctions to give way in a half-light, that each has its possibility. The large goal in my own mind is how would we embrace the contradiction of those two possibilities? And that would be the deepest contemplation I can think of. Are there, this is Anthony Estevez, a very nice question. Are there contemporary spaces, maybe even in America, you know of, that have been created to activate ainoma? The Japanese garden at Amherst College does that. Any number of Japanese gardens that have been built in the United States inevitably to some degree summon up or evoke ainoma. But that's not your question. There are buildings in America. I'm thinking the first one that comes to my mind, and I'm just leaping at this, Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. has an extraordinary space between two research wings. And it's in that space that looks western to the Pacific Ocean that somehow gives meaning to the little isolated cabinets of the various researchers and gives a sense of a wholeness. But it's the middle space between two large structures, and down the middle of that there's a stream of water. And so my own thinking is that Louis Kahn, who was aware of things around the world, was perfectly well aware of this. Many people turn to Frank Lloyd Wright as another example. If you've ever been to Falling Water, you will see an amazing example of Frank Lloyd Wright's attempt to inform his architecture with Japanese sensibility. My own personal feeling is the large plate glass windows do not substitute for the paper shoji, and that there's something fundamentally non-ainoma about even his most wonderful work. But that's a nice question, and I guess I would say that, as I said earlier, ainoma is not a Japanese phenomenon alone. It is the phenomenon that occurs when any human being seeks that special place, that infinite distance between solitudes. Rainer Maria Rilke's poem of a more human comment about a more human love captures that in the Western world as well as anything I know.
Thank you so much, Joel. And the questions were wonderful, and I just feel like we've had a refreshing voyage all together this afternoon. And as we're wrapping up, I just want to say in response to some of the questions that are looking for some of the resource material that Joel mentioned, we will try to post that with the archived webinar, a little bibliography to go along with it, including In Praise of Shadows and What is Japanese Architecture and some of the other things that are mentioned. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're hoping to resume our series of webinars in 2010, and we will let you know just as soon as we have the presenters confirmed. And please, members, join us again, and others, and let us know how the webinar went for you. We're here at the center and happy to hear your responses. So good afternoon to you all. Bye-bye.